Hello and welcome to Written Words. Today's lesson is called Word Order Matters. Mostly. In this lesson we're going to explore some English word order rules and the differences between word order in prose and in poetry. In English, word order is important. Changing the order of words in a sentence can change the meaning slightly, change it drastically, or even render the sentence meaningless. The general pattern of subject, verb, object has to be adhered to in order to avoid confusion. To take an example, we can say, a horse eats grass. A horse is the subject, eats is the verb, and grass is the object. However, if we change the order of those words and say grass eats a horse, we end up with something nonsensical. Grass doesn't eat horses, horses eat grass. So the word order in this particular case is very important. In some languages, putting a word at the beginning of a sentence gives it more emphasis, but this doesn't necessarily work in English. Therefore, you can say, I am happy, but you can't say, happy I am. It doesn't make sense. However, there is one place where word order rules can be relaxed, and that is poetry. Poets are given free rein to play around with structures, with grammar, and with all sorts of linguistic norms. And they can even alter facts and truths in the interests of their art. This is called poetic license. Just about anything that makes a poem more beautiful or more effective is allowed. And with these more fluid rules, the rhythm and the structure of the poem help to carry the meaning instead. Unless, of course, the poet is deliberately trying to confuse the reader. A good example of a poet playing around with grammar rules is A Narrow Fellow in the Grass by Emily Dickinson. It's a poem describing a snake in the grass. And the first verse goes like this. A narrow fellow in the grass occasionally rides. You may have met him, did you not? His notice instant is. If this was a piece of prose, it would be full of grammatical errors. But because it's poetry, the poet is allowed to disregard the rules. In ordered, rule-abiding prose, it might read something along the lines of, a narrow fellow rides in the grass. You may have met him, have you not? He is instantly noticed. Instead, though, Dickinson is able to choose which word she wants at the beginning and the end of each line. She can alter constructions to place stress and emphasis where she wants to. She can play around with the number of syllables, and the freer punctuation reflects the more unstructured way the human mind thinks, as opposed to a well-ordered, well-structured piece of written prose. Now we're going to read the first 4 verses of a long poem called Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard by Thomas Gray. The poem describes a countryside scene. A ploughman is on his way home from work, and the poet describes the landscape and the churchyard he happens to walk past. Before we read these 4 verses, let's just look at some of the vocabulary used in there. The first line has the word tolls. Toll is what a bell does. It means to ring. So the bell is ringing, and the knell is the sound of the ringing. Then he mentions the lowing herd. Lowing is the sound that cows make. It's the mooing sound that cows make. The fourth verse also mentions the yew tree. The yew tree is a tree commonly found in churchyards. These 4 verses don't actually mention the word churchyard at all, but we know from the bell, from the yew tree, and from the graves that are mentioned later that it is a churchyard. The word turf refers to the ground, the soil with grass growing in it in the churchyard. And a hamlet is a small village, a very tiny village with just a few houses, and in this case a churchyard as well. So the poem goes like this. The curfew tolls the knell of parting day. The lowing herd winds slowly o'er the lea. The ploughman homeward plods his weary way, and leaves the world to darkness and to me. Now fades the glimmering landscape on the sight, and all the air a solemn stillness holds, save where the beetle wheels his droning flight, and drowsy tinklings lull the distant folds. Save that from yonder ivy-mantled tower, the moping owl does to the moon complain of such as wandering near her secret bower molest her ancient solitary reign. Beneath those rugged elms, that yew tree's shade, where heaves the turf in many a mouldering heap, each in his narrow cell forever laid, the rude forefathers of the hamlet sleep. So where in these 4 verses can we find some examples of the poet taking liberties with the word order? In the first verse, the 3rd line reads, "The ploughman homeward plods his weary way." In prose, it would more likely say, "The ploughman plods his weary way homeward." But the poet here is allowed to change the word order, and he wants homeward to be more prominent in the sentence. He also wants way to be at the end of the line because it rhymes with day. In the 2nd verse, this begins with, "Now fades the glimmering landscape." Again, the verb comes before the subject here. It would normally be, "The glimmering landscape fades," but he's put fades at the beginning. He wants to place more emphasis on it. He wants it further towards the beginning of the sentence. Then he says, "And all the air a solemn stillness holds." Holds is the verb, but that's right at the end of this line. It would normally be, "The air holds a solemn stillness," but holds rhymes with folds. And this is poetry, so he can put it at the end of the sentence. In the 3rd verse, talking about the owl, "The moping owl does to the moon complain." The owl is the subject, the moon is the object, complain is the verb, but it's at the end of the sentence. It just happens to rhyme with rain. He's also added does for emphasis. The moping owl does to the moon complain. Then in the 4th verse, he says, "Where heaves the turf," instead of "where the turf heaves." And then "each in his narrow cell forever laid," instead of "each laid forever in his narrow cell." But laid rhymes with shade, so it's much more convenient to put it at the end of the line. Now for our language focus, let's talk a little bit more about what subject, verb, object actually means. A verb is commonly described as a doing word. It's some kind of action. The subject is the person or the thing performing the action. And the object is the person or thing on the receiving end of the action. Let's look at an example. The man played the piano. The man is the subject because he's the one doing the action. Played is the verb, that is the action that is taking place. And the piano is the object because that's having the action done to it. So this is a very simple sentence, just with 3 components. But of course, sentences can be much more complex, and we can add other information to this sentence. But if we did that, the subject, the verb and the object would remain in the same order relative to each other. So, for example, we could say, the man who recently arrived from America played the piano beautifully last night. There's a lot more information in that sentence. There are many more words, many more parts of speech, all sorts of things going on. But the subject, the man, the verb, played, and the object, the piano, are still in the same order. There are some extra grammatical rules which do allow us to change the word order to a certain extent, but these are slightly more complex, so we'll take a look at those in a subsequent lesson. For our writing prompt, there are 2 stages. First of all, write down 4 sentences describing a piece of music you have heard. This could be a piece of music you love or a piece of music you hate. When you've done that, try converting those 4 sentences into 4 lines of poetry. This time you can be more imaginative, you can relax the rules, you can play around with the words, but try to make your 4 lines of poetry reflect the music as closely as possible. Don't forget to download the worksheet for this lesson. It recaps all the things we've discussed. There are some questions to get you thinking and some ideas for further reading. Thank you very much for joining me in this lesson. I look forward to seeing you in the next one, and in the meantime, happy writing.